Hi, my name is Lisa Templin, and I am a PhD candidate at Western University, where I study Shakespeare and early modern drama. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce my supervisor, Dr. M.J. Kidnie, who will be speaking to us about Shakespeare's Fourth Folio, a copy of which has been recently donated to Western's library and which is here with us tonight. Dr. Kidnie is a professor in the Department of English and Writing Studies at Western, and her research centers on early modern English drama by playwrights such as Shakespeare, Heywood, and Johnson. She's edited both the prose and drama of the period. Her edition of Stubbs' Anatomy of Abuses was awarded an honorable mention from the MLA Committee on Scholarly Editions, and her recent edition of Thomas Heywood's A Woman Killed with Kindness for the Arden Early Modern Drama series was just released this fall. She also has recently published with Sonia Masai a major collection of essays that seeks to provide a snapshot of where we are in Shakespeare's textual studies and book history, which makes Dr. Kidnie the perfect person to speak to us about the importance of Shakespeare's Fourth Folio to Shakespeare's textual studies, scholars of his plays, and Western's library. Dr. Kidnie has also won numerous awards for her teaching, including most recently the Edward G. Bravo Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2017. As her students and I can attest, she is an engaging and dynamic lecturer, and her passion for Shakespeare is evident in every class she teaches. She's been known to leap onto a desk, brandishing an invisible dagger, to deliver a line of impassioned dialogue to bring Shakespeare's words to life. Though I doubt there will be any invisible daggers in this talk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. M.J. Kidnie.
That's really nice. Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it. She has to say nice things about me because I'm her supervisor, right? That's the way that goes. This is a fantastic occasion to be speaking at WordsFest, and I'm so pleased to be here. Western has a spectacular rare books collection. Some of you I know who are here, Mark McDader taking pictures there. He knows all about it. Other people do know. Not everyone does know it though. We have long had one of the world's greatest collection of Milton. Western has more than 800 of Milton's works, which form part of the holdings of the G. William Stewart Jr. collection of Milton and Miltoniana. And now, we have a Shakespeare Fourth Folio. Yay! This is just amazingly exciting news. When Julie Ryan told me about this last year, I was just going, oh, this can't be true. And then she said, but you can't tell anyone. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? But I upheld my end of the bargain. I did not tell anybody until it came to be public knowledge. We are hugely grateful to Dr. Robert Luton for donating this very special book to our library and our university. There's something about very old books that gives you an odd feeling of actually being in the presence of great authors. A book like the Fourth Folio, published in 1685, feels like a link or a connection directly back to Shakespeare. And I've realized I have to actually ask for the images to be forwarded. So we'll go forward with one image, please. That's our, they call it the Ark, which is sort of wonderful. It's like Noah's Ark, right? It's our archive and research collection center at Western. Open to the public, you have to make an appointment to come along, but it's a wonderful place in Weldon Library to visit. And if we go along to the next one, there's our Fourth Folio, the opening title page of the Fourth Folio. Now, I did a lot of work about 10 years ago on a set of manuscript plays that date to about 1630. This author, who's anonymous, probably new to Gate, is not a Shakespeare. Really, he was not a Shakespeare. He was a pretty poor, in fact, amateur dramatist. And yet, I spent a lot of time on his works and developed quite an affection for his work. Image, please. Most of my research was completed using microfilm copies of the original manuscript, much like what you see today was what I was working from on my computer. Access to the manuscript itself was difficult because it was, and still is, owned by James Newdigate, the 4th Viscount Daventry. Now, Lord Daventry wasn't keen on having a researcher from Canada turn up at his estate at Arbory Hall to study an old book in his collection. And yes, I asked if I could. But late in the research process, I really did have to see the original. Photographs are, Photographs are great. This is a photograph of one of the openings from this miscellany where the plays were bound together. Photographs are great, at least it's something. But they're no substitute for the real thing. If you're working on close editorial work, something that looks like a dot on an I in an image like that might actually be nothing but dust. The camera really does lie a lot of the time when you're doing this kind of detailed work. So Lord Daventry agreed to put his book on temporary loan at the Warwickshire County Record Office in England, and I traveled to Warwick to use it. There was a really amazing, take your breath away moment when the archivist brought this old book to me at the desk at which I was sitting. This thing that I'd worked on for so many years. Over comes this book. I opened the cover, and there were the handwritten pages that I knew so well from my computer screen, except now there was nothing separating me from the book. I was holding it in my hands. Oh, it was a wonderful moment. I was holding the very pages on which the author, my author, composed his plays about 500 years ago. It was fantastic. And working in archives and rare book collections is definitely one of the joys of scholarly research. Now, the irony of the story I've just told you is that that manuscript book has since been lost. Another scholar tried to use it last year. She's editing another one of the plays in this collection, and Lord Daventry couldn't find it anymore. Now that's the thing about manuscripts, and also about some very rare books. Lisa mentioned A Woman Killed with Kindness that I've just edited for Arden. There's one copy of the 1607 edition that's left in the world. They're unique, and once they're gone, they're gone. The scholarly record is filled with discussion of books that someone once saw or said that they saw, but that can no longer be located. One of the worst moments as a researcher is working at a place like the British Library in London, England, and calling up a rare book only to get in return the notification, destroyed in the war. My own personal theory is that that manuscript book I used is still kicking around. But Lord Daventry, probably quite rightly, is just sick of researchers knocking on his door asking to use it. And that's the other thing about rare books. And it's part of what makes Dr. Luton's donation to Western University so special. Books can be precious, sometimes extremely precious, and they're always owned by someone. Books in a private collection aren't available to the general public except by special permission. By donating his copy of the 4th Folio to Western University, Dr. Luton has made this extremely valuable book available to students and the general public in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So I can't say again how grateful we are to Dr. Luton for this astounding act of generosity. And if you haven't yet seen it, it's in that glass cabinet over there against the wall. So please do make sure that you take a look at it before you leave today. So I can hear you saying, MJ, you keep talking about this 4th Folio as precious and valuable. Not to be vulgar and mercantile, but what exactly are we talking about here, right? Value is a tricky thing to pin down, especially if you're talking about books. Many of you will still have your old hockey card or maybe your comic book collection. And you know that as soon as you open the wrapper, the price of the card depreciates. Books are kind of the same. Factors that influence the value of a book include the completeness of the book. Old books are often damaged. Missing pages, especially the last pages or the first pages, often go missing. Also a consideration is the cleanness of the pages. I personally love reading old books with marginalia, where someone who's read this book in the past has gone through it and marked it up with their comments. Or sometimes, especially with old books, you get a hand with a pointing finger pointing in at a particular passage. It's like, pay attention to this. I love that kind of marginalia, but such markings tend to decrease the book's market value. Another thing that can affect price is the quality of the binding and whether or not that binding is original. All of these objective details aside, markets are fickle things. Image, please. How much would you pay for Van Gogh's Sunflowers? I remember my dad once saying that he wouldn't walk across the street to look at the painting, never mind spend millions on it. Value, to some extent, is always in the eye of the beholder. Now, I have a copy of the first folio of Shakespeare, and I brought it with me to show it to you today. Here it is. I own a copy of the first folio of Shakespeare. Here it is. It's even got the picture. Let me see if I can get the picture up here at the front of the famous picture of Shakespeare. Bear with me. Oh, for goodness sake. So I'm doing it backwards here. This is why it's taking me so long. There he is. The first folio of Shakespeare with that famous drosha engraving of Shakespeare. So here is my copy of the first folio. Now, as you can guess in the way I'm throwing it around here, it isn't an original of the first folio. It's a facsimile of the first folio, sort of a copy of the 1623 publication. It contains all the content, plus a little bit more. You get a couple of introductions thrown in for free, all of Shakespeare, and then you can have a bit of Hinman and a bit of Peter Blaney as well. These are really handy. The Hinman and Blaney introductions, they're the leading scholars in First Folio of the 20th and 21st century. But when we're talking about old books and the value of old books, we're not just talking about content. We're also talking about something that's really hard to put your finger on, but maybe we might call it, after Benjamin, aura. It's the aura of the book. It's about history. And that sense of, and in bibliographical terms, the fact of a link back to a time that is now forever gone. So when Shakespeare's first folio was published in 1623, the first folio is the direct ancestor of the fourth folio that we have here on display today. It was an expensive, prestigious volume. The original buyers of the first folio would have paid a whole whopping £1 for the 900-page book bound in calfskin. That's about $200 to $250 in today's money. And before you sneer too quickly at that price, just think how many of you are going to swing through chapters this Christmas to buy a book, a single book, worth $250. That's real money. That's serious coin if you're just buying a book off the shelves. But many of you will probably remember the news last year, the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, of the first, second, third, and fourth folios going under the hammer at Christie's in London for just over $4 million. Image. One collector bought the lot. They called it the literary Holy Grail. And that collector, anonymous, paid just over $3 million for the first folio alone. In 2001, a first folio sold at Christie's for nearly 8 million. These are all Canadian dollars I'm quoting. In 2006, a first folio sold at Sotheby's for $6.5 million. Fourth folios don't command quite the same price as a first folio. There's an aura, to return to that word, about the first folio that makes it stand apart from the volumes that follow, but it is still a hugely valuable book. A Shakespearean friend of mine in the States, it's Eric Rasmussen, owns a fourth folio, and his kid fondly refers to it as his college bursary. The appreciation value of these things is frankly pretty good. Now, the word folio might be a little bit off-putting to some of you. Everyone throws it around. Shakespeare's first folio, Shakespeare's fourth folio. Of course, I've seen the folio over at Museum London, but it's a bit jargony. What is a folio? Folio is just a shorthand way to describe a certain kind of book. There's a piece of paper on your table. Each of you, please, pick up your piece of paper. Each of you, get a piece of paper. I feel like I'm on Blue Peter. Get a piece of paper. Take that piece of paper in your hands. Every book in the hand press period, that's how they printed books in Shakespeare's time, began as a pile of blank paper, a pile of blank sheets of paper, much like, well, this one isn't blank because this is my lecture notes, much like this one. Imagine it blank on both sides. Now, here you go. We're gonna make some books here. Take that piece of paper and fold it in half. Mark McDader, fold your paper. He's a bibliographer, he knows all about this. Now take your piece of paper and fold it a second time. And you should end up with something much like this. And as you see, you've got it kind of joined up at the tops but free at the bottom. All right. Books that were made of sheets of paper folded twice were called quartos. As you can see, this is a quarto here, or this is a gathering of a quarto. Once you cut these folds across the top, you're going to end up with 4 leaves of paper or 8 pages. Yeah? Quarto, the Latin root of the word quarto, is 4. That's what quarto means. Now, unfold your sheets just once, so you get it to this kind of size, leaving just one fold. This produces a gathering of 2 leaves or 4 pages. A Shakespeare folio is simply a book that has been set up using this single fold format. That's all that folio means. Folio, and the fourth folio is a folio in 6s, which means that they would put 6 of these together, and that counts as your gathering. And then you just keep stitching it up until you've got a 900-page volume. Now, folio. Folio was a format that tended to be used for physically big and therefore expensive and so often prestigious projects. Book price in Shakespeare's time, you'll be amazed by this, is not driven by authors being paid for their manuscripts or anything like that. It was driven almost entirely by the price of paper, which had to be imported from Europe, continental Europe. The second quarto of Hamlet, image please, runs to 104 pages. That adds up to 13 sheets of paper folded twice. That's just the title page to the second quarto. Hamlet in folio, so remember, Hamlet in quarto is 104 pages, which is 13 sheets. Hamlet in folio runs to 31 pages, each page printed in a double column, and that adds up to 8 sheets of paper folded once. So you would save on paper and so expenses if you printed Hamlet in folio, but it would result in an extremely thin pamphlet, oversized in its physical dimensions. It would be an awkward, odd-looking book and very easily damaged because you'd only have 8 sheets of paper bound together, like a big size book like this with only 8 sheets of paper. The first thing I think you would want to do when you get it is fold it in half and shove it in your pocket. It's too flimsy because it's not deep enough in terms of its depth. In quarto, however, Hamlet makes a nice size book. It's still a pamphlet, but you could stitch the pages together, those pages together, and even bind it, and it would be extremely usable. It would feel much like a modern day paperback. It would have that kind of aesthetic to it. Single plays were never, in this period, as far as I'm aware, printed in folio. The quarto format was extremely popular among publishers in Shakespeare's day for drama. This isn't to say that buyers wouldn't then reformat their purchases to suit themselves. So buyers, not infrequently, bought their quartos of drama unbound. They would just get them in cheap paper wrappers, and they would have then a copy of the play, and then they would get another copy of another play, and once they got maybe 8 or 12 plays together, they would take them themselves to the publisher and say, will you bind this together for me as a book? And we called those samobands. Samobands were in effect, I don't like competition, but that's okay, I'm joking. Samobands were in effect customized books. Such collections made it easier to keep track of individual quartos, and they would look nice on a library shelf. And we all know it's nice to have books that look nice, right? The thicker volume would help to preserve the plays bound within, and these volumes were extremely personalized. The collections might be arbitrary, but more likely a buyer, a customer, would gather groups of plays that she, often it was a she, these readers in the period, or he would want to, that were meaningful for a particular owner. So these Samoband quarto collections are customer-led, not publisher-led. So the publisher produces drama as thin, unbound quartos. The customer gathered those quartos together in a more monumental format. The folio format, by contrast, was reserved by publishers for long books. When it came to works of literature, the guiding category for folio publication was typically the author. So the first living author to have a collected folio edition called his works was Samuel Daniel, and that was published in 1601 and then reprinted in 1602. Edmund Spenser had a posthumous folio collection of his works published in 1611. Michael Drayton, all these are poets. Michael Drayton's works were likewise collected in folio in 1619 and reprinted in 1620. Poetry, 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 high ranking for the most part, noblemen. As these examples show, there were certainly authorial literary collections in folio prior to Shakespeare's folio in 1623. But notably, all of these collections were of poetry and sometimes poetry and prose, not drama. The professional stage in England was still relatively new and extremely controversial, both politically and morally. A lot of people still weren't sure what they thought about theater and plays. So plays circulated in print. There was a market for drama in print, but only in the cheaper, smaller, more disposable quarto and octavo formats. You see I slipped that word in. Octavo, just take your quarto, fold it one more time. That's eighths, okay? The only folio collection of native English drama prior to Shakespeare, image please, actually I should say, I guess, I put it too quick, I should have made you guess, was the works of Ben Jonson in 1616. This is your title page for Jonson's works. You can see author portrait on the left, title page on the right, works of Benjamin Jonson. This was a landmark folio volume precisely because it declared a prestige for drama that nobody before had dared to claim for the genre. but it was also mocked. One wit mocked in verse, it's anonymous, but I love this. Pray tell me, Ben, where doth the mystery lurk? What others call a play, you call a work. So this idea of the pretentiousness, it's so Johnsonian in so many ways, the pretentiousness of elevating plays to works. The first folio of Shakespeare came 7 years later in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, and they did not make that same mistake of elevating plays to works. It was published with the assistance of Shakespeare's friends and colleagues in the theater. Only the plays were included in the first folio. The narrative poems didn't get a look in, neither did the sonnets. The title page, here we go. This is Shakespeare's first folio. Image, please. Oh, I put that up there. I should have put that, I forgot that. Thank you, next one. There you go, there's Shakespeare. And the title page, as you can read there on the right-hand side, Master William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. The importance of the first folio really cannot be overstated. 36 plays were included in the first folio. This book produced for Shakespeare a substantial body of work that was instantly recognizable as a canon. And that's what made Shakespeare, if he wasn't already, a literary author. Another important thing that it did is it defined the genres by which we still commonly categorize the plays. Shakespeare, you learned this in high school, right? Shakespeare wrote comedies, histories, and tragedies. How do you know that? It says it on the title page, right? Who writes a history play? Nobody writes history plays except Shakespeare, because Hemming and Condell said he did on the title page. The histories, it's not a common generic category apart from the plays of Shakespeare. A play like Richard III, which some of you know very well indeed, could very easily be described as a tragedy. And it was in fact published in quarto prior to the folio as a tragedy in Shakespeare's lifetime. The other importance of the folio is that this was the first time fully half of the plays in the folio reached print. 36 plays were published in the folio, 18 of them had never been published before. And you're probably thinking, oh, well, that's like Comedy of Errors and Taming of the Shrew, and you would be right. But it's also Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, Antony and Cleopatra, and one of my favorite plays, The Winter's Tale. And there were 18 of these that were saved for posterity only by publication in the first folio. Now you might assume that if the first folio hadn't come around, these plays would have somehow found their way into print. But that's by no means certain. 2 plays now accepted to be collaborations to which Shakespeare substantially contributed were omitted from the folio. Pericles was published in quarto in 1609, and The Two Noble Kinsmen was published in quarto very late, 18 years after Shakespeare's death, in 1634. The quarto of Pericles, which was published in 1609, not reprinted in the folio, is corrupt. So we have no good or reliable surviving copy of this play. Pericles was one of the most popular plays that Shakespeare wrote in his own time. We don't have a copy of Pericles as the audience loved it in Shakespeare's time. It seems pure luck that Two Noble Kinsmen managed to make its way into print very late in the day. The example of Thomas Heywood is instructive here. He wrote Woman Killed with Kindness. I've edited him. He's one of my authors. I'm very fond of Thomas Heywood. Heywood claimed to have had, and I'm quoting here, an entire hand, or at least a main finger, in 220 plays. I actually believe him. He had a hugely long career, 40 years, and he wrote like the Dickens. He was very prolific. But many of those plays were lost in his own lifetime, either as a result of the confusion caused by theater companies disbanding and amalgamating and moving from one theater to another, And also, or also, as a result of the players choosing to hold on to their property rather than sell them to the printing houses for print publication. Of the 220 plays that Heywood claims to have authored or co-authored, wait for it, barely 20 remain. 1 in 10 of Heywood's plays have survived. The rest are lost, gone. Heywood was the second most popular playwright in his own time, if you go by publications in quarto, after Shakespeare. And we've lost 90% of his plays. We also know of 2 Shakespeare plays that haven't survived. We know of 2 that haven't survived. Love's Labour's 1 is mentioned in a printer's catalogue of 1603 and is attested to by Francis Mears in 1598 as a comedy by Shakespeare, and no copy of that quarto survives, and it was not reprinted in the first folio. Cardenio is another problem. There are references to performance of this play in 1613, and the bookseller and publisher Humphrey Moseley attributes the play to Shakespeare in 1653 when he asserts his exclusive publishing rights to it, but he never got around to publishing it. Why didn't these plays, Love's Labour's 1 and Cardenio, get included in the folio? Are they real plays or just alternative titles for existing plays? It's impossible to know. The other thing, I guess the last point that I want to make that bears on the folio's importance is that it created a kind of mythology around Shakespeare that I have to deal with day in, day out as a professor of Shakespeare at the university level. This mythology of Shakespeare as a theatrical and literary genius. Honestly, the number of times you ask students to read in a class and you get a British accent. It's just like, this is Shakespeare. You have to do something special for Shakespeare. In there, I think this can be tracked back to the first folio. In their letter to the reader, his theater buddies, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, claimed that Shakespeare was, and I'm quoting, a happy imitator of nature. And they go on, his mind and hand went together. And what he thought, he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. And I know I'm at 35 minutes, and that's when people start to fade away on me here. Come back. Because you want to hear this. I'm going to say it again. What he thought, he uttered with that easiness. Uttered means poured out on paper with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. Seriously? I can't even write a talk for WordsFest without having to go back and revise bits and pieces that I think I could do a little bit better. Shakespeare wrote Hamlet and Twelfth Night without once crossing out a word? Are you kidding me? It just flowed ready-made from his mind onto the paper. It is an outrageous claim, but it shaped persistent notions of Shakespeare as a literary genius. I bet you there's at least one of you in this room right now who's just waiting for question time to say, well, MJ, I bet you he could, because it's Shakespeare, right? So this idea of Shakespeare the genius, and it goes back to the first folio. They also claimed that earlier publications of Shakespeare's plays were diverse, stolen, and surreptitious copies, maimed and deformed by the frauds and stealths of injurious imposters. So they're saying all the earlier quartos that you've been subject to, they're rubbish. Nasty cheats and pirates forced those on you, and they were no good. They're not the good plays. We have the good plays in the folio. That claim has had a huge impact on textual scholarship since the early 20th century, as editors and theater historians have tried to puzzle through how it is that we have substantially different versions of some of Shakespeare's greatest plays. We have 3 very different versions of Hamlet, for example, 2 very different versions of King Lear. What was going on in the theaters, and how did Shakespeare write his plays that could have led to this textual situation? The first folio was thus a huge financial venture, and it was undertaken by a syndicate of publishers. They were both pooling their resources and spreading the risk, so that if it was a fail, nobody would be broken by it financially. Their investment and labor, and frankly creative genius, produced an expensive, highly collectible, prestige volume. Shakespeare's Folio, again, first published in 1623, wasn't reprinted until 1632. And then the third folio appeared in 1663, and that brings us to our folio, the fourth folio of 1685. In their own time, these subsequent volumes were regarded as what we might call new and improved versions of the old thing. The Bodleian Library, archivists among us, sit up and pay attention here if you don't know this story already. The Bodleian Library at Oxford University famously disposed of their first folio in the mid-1600s, probably because it was deemed superfluous after they acquired the third folio in 1664. They sent it off to the grad students' bake sale so that someone could make some money off it. When their copy surfaced again in 1905, they mounted a huge campaign to get it back, paying for it the then unheard sum of £3,000. Nowadays, textual scholars have shown that subsequent folios are basically reprints of the immediately previous volume. So the second folio reprints the first folio, the third reprints the second, and the fourth reprints the third. As a result, the quality of the reproductions is characterized by textual deterioration. They become more and more corrupt. And this is sort of an intuitive thing I think you can get. No matter how carefully you copy something, you will always introduce, either deliberately or accidentally, changes to the original. And there's a lovely example of this kind of inadvertent change in the fourth folio. Image, please. I know it's sometimes a little bit hard. Can you see where that is? The what?
The armpits.
That's right. The tragedy of Hamlet. Arpints of Denmark. But I absolutely don't want to do down these later folios and their importance. Printers corrected obvious errors when they noticed it. So they did get around to correcting arpints as they went on in subsequent editions. But largely the situation is one of increasing corruption and improvements in the sense of spelling and punctuation being modernized to current fashions. The fourth folio, however, and this is where I want to make a plug for the fourth folio in particular, and I'm kind of looking over it quite affectionately, our book. The fourth folio stands apart from the second and third folios as especially interesting. It is the first volume not only to introduce 7 new plays to the canon, but to include them in the catalog or table of contents at the front of the book. So this is the opening, and in fact that is the opening that they have in the glass cabinet. So you can see they've moved the image of Shakespeare to the left with the To the Reader underneath it, and then you have the title page. And underneath Comedy's History Tragedy, you can see plays. Those are the new plays. They're announcing 7 new plays, and they itemize the 7 plays underneath them. Only one of these plays, new plays in the fourth folio, Pericles, has since been accepted into the Shakespeare canon. The other 6 are all part of the Apocrypha. Apocrypha just means plays that have at one time or another been attributed to Shakespeare on what is now considered insufficient or spurious evidence. The 6 plays that we no longer accept as Shakespeare's, but that appeared in the fourth folio, are The London Prodigal, The History of Thomas Lord Cromwell, Sir John Oldcastle, The Puritan Widow, A Yorkshire Tragedy, and The Tragedy of Locrine. And if you haven't heard of those plays, it's because they're not Shakespeare, right? It's not clear if the publishers were trying to deceive the readers or not. The London Prodigal, A Yorkshire Tragedy, and Pericles had all previously been published in quarto and attributed on their title pages to Shakespeare. So there was reasonable bibliographical evidence for thinking that they were Shakespeare's. Cromwell, The Puritan Widow, and Locrine had all been published on their title pages as written by W.S. and Sir John Oldcastle had been published in 1619 as part of the Pavier collection. He was doing a collection of Shakespeare's works before the 1623 edition that got shut down, and it was attributed there to Shakespeare. So even if these plays weren't by Shakespeare, and actually now we think Pericles actually is, at least partly by Shakespeare, there was an idea in the 17th century that they were Shakespeare, or at least Shakespearean. The other respect, and this is the point that I want to end on here today, the other respect in which the fourth folio is so interesting is in terms of its corrected readings. My colleague at Western, James Purkis, argues that the fourth folio is the second most important folio after the first one. Not the second or the third, it's the fourth. This is because there is some evidence that some of the plays were edited in the modern sense of the word. What I mean here by edited is that someone proofread parts of the third folio in advance of the publication of the fourth folio. So they got a copy of the third folio, marked it up, looked at it, thought of some of the places, located some of the places that were textually corrupt, and thought, what was it that they were trying to say there? And they corrected it. We call that amended it. They found a way of making those passages make sense. Sonia Massai, a colleague and friend of mine at King's College London in England, pulls together the evidence that an unnamed editor is behind some of the corrections made to the fourth folio, and this is in her wonderful 2007 book called Shakespeare and the Rise of the Editor. So this person located and reconsidered corrupt readings and then introduced reasonable, sometimes excellent corrections in an effort to perfect, in other words, to make perfect the reading text. Now, whoever it was did not go back to the first folio or to the early quartos or even to manuscripts, if we can assume that manuscripts still survived in and around 1685. But he, and probably it was a he, gave interpretive thought to cruxes in certain passages. And this is sometimes all that even a modern editor can do. A passage is obviously corrupt, and you just have to try to figure out what the intended reading might have been. Sure, it's a speculative process, but it's necessary, because when a book has printed gibberish, gobbledygook, you don't want to reprint that. You want to have a stab at what the reading might have been. So, this is where it gets kind of interesting. Whose hand might be behind the corrections, the revised readings, the emendations that were introduced in the fourth folio? Possibly it was the publisher Herringman. He was certainly capable of it, both in terms of time and literary interest, but he seemed to prefer to outsource this kind of work. Whenever he had other big projects, he would outsource it to somebody else. If it wasn't Herringman, then it seems highly likely that the hand we can sporadically trace in the fourth folio belongs to one of two poets laureate who were in London around 1685. I'm looking at Mark McDader here, my colleague at Western, because this is squarely in his period. And I guess the joke here at Wordsworth is that even poets laureate need to keep their day job, right? Working at publishing houses, correcting someone else's texts. There is an outside chance. I hope this will work. One more, please. Yep. There's an outside chance that the editor of the fourth folio was John Dryden. That's his portrait there. Dryden was England's first poet laureate, named such in 1668. Dryden was a frequent adapter of Shakespeare's drama. He adapted The Tempest in 1670 and Troilus and Cressida in 1679. He wrote an original play called All for Love in 1678, inspired by Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. He also emended and annotated the 1683 quarto edition of Hamlet in light of the then current theatrical traditions. More than that, we know that Dryden regularly undertook editorial work for Harrington. He was one of the journeyman workers in Harrington's shop. He may even have lived with Dryden, or lived with Harrington in his house, kind of shared, kind of roommates, I suppose. But by 1684, when the fourth folio was presumably in preparation, it seems that Harrington's preferred editorial assistant was named Tate. Now, Tate became poet laureate in 1692, 7 years after the fourth folio was published. Like Dryden, Tate adapted Shakespeare's drama for the stage. Most famously, he wrote King Lear with a happy ending. King Lear gets his kingdom back, wins the war. He and Cordelia live happily ever after. It was Tate's version of the play that commanded the English stage for hundreds of years. He also adapted Coriolanus in 1682 as the ingratitude of a commonwealth. And what is especially notable about that detail is that a number of the changes to Coriolanus that turn up in the fourth folio first appear in Tate's adaptation. So there's no question but that we're on shaky ground in terms of identifying who might have corrected the third folio for subsequent publication in 1685 as the fourth folio. But there seems to be reasonable, even persuasive grounds for thinking that the version of the folio that we now have as part of our rare books collection here at Western is indebted to the creativity not only of Shakespeare, but one of our two poets laureate. Thank you. Oh, there was one more. Yes, there. Oh, go back. Oh, I scared you. I'm sorry. I do that to people. There's Dryden. All's well, all's for love. That's Tate. There's the history of King Lear. I forgot that last image there. We have a few minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions or has any time. I promised Josh that I would save some time for questions afterwards. Is Dr. Luton here? Can we celebrate? You're Dr. Luton? Can I do this? You got it? Okay. We're going to get you a microphone. I'm guessing that you're not Robert Luton.
Was the type reset each time for each folio?
Yes, it was. Was the type reset? Absolutely it would have. They wouldn't have kept that standing type for that many years, for sure. And the first folio for sure, and I would expect the subsequent folios as well, they were casting off, so they were setting it up in form. So they would have been printing off the pages and then distributing the type as they went. Because otherwise, I don't think any printer, I'm certain no printer in this period, would have had enough type in order to have that whole book printed in one go. Yeah, thank you.
So they would have to.
Oh, wait.
It's okay.
Oh.
So the whole room can hear your question.
Okay. So if they're printing page by page and then reusing the slugs for the next page, how do they decide what their print run is going to be? Presumably they print, 100 pages and then change the type bed. Do you know?
Yeah. The print run, I believe, for the first folio, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's 550 copies. They would print 550 copies of each page. So what they would do is they would print, so you have it like this, you have your page folded in half, right? So this is page 1, this is page 2, page 3, and page 4. So you sort of see, when you're setting this up, page 1 and page 4 go together. When you're printing this, because they had to press it down onto the inked pages. Page 1 and 4 gets printed. They do 550 of those. Then they hang it up over the line, like your laundry, to dry. And then they set up the other side of it, and then they put this page in again and print the other side 550 times. While they're doing this, someone, as the pages are coming off the press, is reading through and correcting it. And then they will catch mistakes and they'll sort of correct it as they go. They'll stop the press, they'll open up the type, they'll make changes and correct it, and then continue printing off their 550. But those pages that were already printed, uncorrected, they still got put into the volume. So every book is potentially different because it will have, it's not like they put one book with all of the uncorrected pages. It was just you got pages as it went. So you'll have a random mix of corrected and uncorrected pages in your copy of the folio. So that's why I sort of said this book here that I brought here, the facsimile, it's a kind of a copy of a first folio, because what Hinman did is take corrected sheets from a whole bunch of different copies of the folio to produce his facsimile that scholars use. No folio at the time, except by random luck, and we haven't found any folio that is, would have all corrected sheets in it. Does that make, so this is kind of a hybrid thing.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it is an extraordinary thing. When you sort of realize that compositors have this sheet in front of them, and they've got to set the words in their composing stick backwards in order to set it in so that it goes in the right way. It's just extraordinary that they don't make more errors than they did, you know? Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So does that answer my question then? When I looked at the title page, that there are a number of S's that look like F's.
That's the long S, and that's a printing convention. It comes from secretary hand. So there is a form of the S in handwriting at this time that is the long S. And they just call it, so we have a small S, and they had that S. They had a couple of different kinds of S's, depending on the handwriting. But this long S was just one of them, and that is used in the printing houses. So you'll get some small S's that we're familiar with, and then also the long S as well. And this is kind of an interesting point. So in the folio, Prospero is described. Now, how does it go? Something about Prospero. The crux is W-I, and then this long letter, E. And it's relating to Prospero. Now, is the word Prospero and the word is wise with a long S? Or are they talking about Prospero and the letter is an F that's just missing its bar across there, and it's wife? So the difference between wife and wise is, you think, how could you confuse an F and an S? But when you actually look at a book like that, and you go, oh my gosh, you very easily, because it's just the tiniest of bars that would distinguish and that would turn a long S into an F. And this type, as this lady here was telling us about, it was treated pretty roughly. You know, you'd get it, you put it into your stick, you put it in, and it gets pressed down 550 times, then it's opened up, they get thrown back into the cases and used again. So type did get damaged. It would deteriorate over time, and those little bars could become damaged. So it's not impossible that an F could eventually come to look at an S. And then you have editors like me and Mark 500 years down the road trying to figure out, so is it Prospero wise or Prospero wife that we're talking about? And it's sometimes, it just comes back to your own aesthetic judgment. Do you like to have a wife in this play, or do you want to have Prospero as wise? A lot of generations of male editors could only see Prospero and wise. And one of the first female editors of the play, somebody went, but couldn't it be wife? What about the wife? So it kind of depends on your perspective. Yeah. Yeah, Julie.
So the size of the book seems awkward. Like, you wouldn't, how did they use that book? Would they put it on a pedestal? They wouldn't have it in their lap.
It's like the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's an awkward, it is a monumental text. I think I remember my dad reading Serum, and you remember Serum, like way back, like what, 20 years ago? He says, you try to read this book in bed, if you ever fell asleep, it would crush you, right? It's that kind of a book. You have to sit up at the kitchen table and read it because it's so heavy. So I think absolutely, it's not, the quartos are lovely. Like they almost can fit in your back pocket, they can fit in a book bag. They are the paperbacks, they're really convenient. The folio, not so convenient. This one, honestly, humping this thing, I hope someone has a car to give me a ride home. Humping this thing down here, it's just a heavy book. So I think, I'm just guessing, like every reader's gonna do their own thing with these books. But I would guess it was going into libraries and would be read in libraries. And an awful lot of folios have survived. So like of a print run of 550, we have the high 200s of these things from the first folio. An awful lot of these things survived. And do you know the people who buy these expensive books and they put it on their shelf and you can just see they've got it on their shelf, and it's partly that. I think there might be a certain amount of that going on with the Shakespeare folio, which is great for a librarian, right? And for an archivist later on, because it's a good way to preserve a book. Put it on a shelf and leave it there for 500 years. It's gonna survive.
I'm aware that in the past, way back, I can certainly remember books from the early 19th century. Before they would print large runs of large books, I'm thinking about an 8-volume set right now, they would have subscribers, people who prepaid or at least committed in some way to buying this large publication to make sure that they weren't stuck with remainders, I guess. So did that ever happen with these folios? Were they ever committed in advance?
Not in this period.
They were done on spec, so to speak.
No, paying by subscription's a later generation of financing this kind of book. And I think that's what is so amazing in part about the Jaggards and Blunt taking on the publication of this first folio, is they had to stump up the costs up front and then seek to make their money back through sales of the book. So it was an immensely risky venture. And these were savvy businessmen, right? They really had to know their market, know exactly how they were pitching it. So the preliminaries that you see in the first folio, like the tribute poem from Ben Jonson, all of these different, and by the time we get, I believe it's the third folio, you get, help me out, I think it's the third folio, we get the poem from Milton, praising Shakespeare. They're very canny in terms of marking it for the audience. And if you go back to that Hemming and Condell, remember as they're saying that we received not a blot from his writing, what he wrote, it was all expressed. Part of that's publishing puff, right? Shakespeare is so fantastic, and this book has copy, even if you have Hamlet already, it's a no good Hamlet. This is the Hamlet you have to have. So, and they finish that letter by saying, think whatever you like about it, but whatever you do, buy the book. And that's not a paraphrase. Buy the book. So they're really emphasizing to get that out precisely because they've got nothing. They've got nothing until it hits the bookstalls and people start buying the folio.
Records as to whether they made money on these?
Yeah, people do. Peter Blaney's done a lot of work on this, and Zach Lester's done this, and I've read the essays, and I can't off the top of my head remember when they thought they started turning a profit. And I think this is partly because Blaney argues one thing, and Zach Lester and Alan Farmer argue the opposite. So Peter Blaney sort of says that plays weren't that popular in the period. They weren't that great at selling. And Lesser and Farmer say, well, yes, they were. And so there's a bit of a debate because we're kind of working, we don't know how many of them were sold. You know what I mean? We're guessing at the print run based on what we know from other information. There's an awful lot of guesswork going on. They, kind of empirically, you can say they must have got their money back and made something like a profit because they brought out another edition. 1632 would never have happened if 1623 hadn't, how many years is that? 9 years. Within at least 9 years, proved a financial success for them. Yes? Sorry.
Last question.
Sorry, was I supposed to say no more questions?
Can you give us
If it's a hard
examples?
one, I'm going to say no more questions.
It might be a hard one. Can you give us any examples off the top of your head of interesting or influential conjectural emendations from the fourth folio?
Isn't that funny? I nearly wrote down a couple before I came here and then thought, oh, no one will be interested in that. Isn't that funny?
You didn't know I'd be here.
Isn't that funny? I nearly put it and went, oh, they don't want that. Let me just see if I can, yes, I can. Yes, I can. Let me see if I can get this right. In Coriolanus, there's a character called Lucius, I'm going to get the last name right, but it's something like Tulsius. And in the third folio, an error is introduced at one point in the dialogue, and that character is described as Lucius Tarsius. In the fourth folio, someone has picked up that change that happens in the dialogue about sort of 200, 400, 300 lines in, and has gone, oh, that must be that character's name, and has gone back and changed that character's name in all the speech prefixes, in the cast list, wherever he turns up, on the basis of, the fourth folio, in that instance, has made it more incorrect. But what you can see is that the emender has noticed something that turns up in the dialogue, and so he says, oh, all the speech prefixes, they must have got that wrong. This must be the right one. And the reason why we know that it is actually wrong, that correction is a wrong correction, is because historically we know what that character was called. Editors since have done that work. But you can sort of see the emender, whether it was Dryden, whether it was Tate, whether it was Harringman, has picked up on something that was introduced in the third edition and then worked it, because it's not just that they pick it up from there and move it on. They've gone back and corrected this earlier part before it's gone to the press at all. So they've looked at the book as its whole thing to make it consistent with itself. We are done. We are done. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate that. It's been a pleasure talking to you about this fantastic new acquisition at Western's Library, and you must come and see it. Book in an appointment. Come to the Ark, along with all of the pairs of animals, and come and see the fourth folio. Thank you.